She put her head back and closed her eyes, aware of a steady low pulse in her throat, not wanting to wake up enough for that pulse to transform itself into what it really was: thirst. She didn't know if she could go from black unconsciousness to ordinary sleep or not, but she knew that was what she wanted more than anything else, except perhaps for someone to drive down here and rescue her. She wanted to sleep. There was no one here, Jesse. You know that, don't you? It was absurdity of absurdities, Ruth's voice. Tough-talking Ruth, whose stated motto, cribbed from a Nancy Sinatra song, was, "One of these days, these boots are gonna walk all over you." Ruth, who had been reduced to a pile of quivering jelly by the shape in the moonlight. "Go ahead, Toots," Ruth said. "Make fun of me all you want. Maybe I even deserve it. But don't kid yourself. There was no one here. Your imagination put on a little slideshow, that's all. That's all there was to it." "You're wrong, Ruth," Goody responded calmly. "Someone was here all right, and Jesse and I both know who it was. It didn't exactly look like Daddy, but that was only because he had his eclipse face on. The face wasn't the important part, though, or how tall he looked. He might have had on boots with special high heels, or maybe he was wearing shoes with lifts in them. For all I know, he could have been on stilts." "Stilts!" Ruth cried, amazed. "Oh, dear God. Now I've heard everything. Never mind the fact that the man died before Reagan's inauguration day tux got back from the cleaners. Tom Mayhood was so clumsy he should have had walking downstairs insurance. Stilts. Oh, babe, you have got to be putting me on." "That part doesn't matter," Goody said with a kind of serene stubbornness. "It was him. I'd know that smell anywhere, that thick, blood-warm smell, not the smell of oysters or pennies, not even the smell of blood, the smell of..." The thought broke up and drifted away. Jessie slept. She ended up alone with her father at Sunset Trails on the afternoon of July 20th, 1963, for two reasons. One was a cover for the other. The cover was her claim that she was still a little frightened of Mrs. Gillette, even though it had been at least 5 years, and probably closer to 6, since the incident of the cookie and the slapped hand. The real reason was simple and uncomplicated. It was her daddy she wanted to be with during such a special once-in-a-lifetime event. Her mother had suspected as much, and being moved around like a chess piece by her husband and her 10-year-old daughter hadn't pleased her. But by then, the matter was practically a fait accompli. Jessie had gone to her daddy first. She was still 4 months away from her 11th birthday, but that didn't make her a fool. What Sally Mayhood suspected was true. Jessie had launched a conscious, carefully thought-out campaign which would allow her to spend the day of the eclipse with her father. Much later, Jessie would think that this was yet another reason to keep her mouth shut above what had happened on that day. There might be those, her mother for instance, who would say that she had no right to complain, that she had in fact gotten about what she deserved. On the day before the eclipse, Jessie had found her father sitting on the deck outside his den and reading a paperback copy of Profiles in Courage with his wife, son, and elder daughter laughed and swam in the lake below. He smiled at her when she took the next seat to him, and Jessie smiled back. She had brightened her mouth with lipstick for this interview, peppermint yum-yum, in fact, a birthday present from Maddie. Jessie hadn't liked it when she first tried it on. She thought it a baby shade, and that it tasted like Pepsodent. But Daddy had said he thought it was pretty, and that had transformed it into the most valuable of her most few cosmetic resources, something to be treasured and used only on special occasions like this one. He listened carefully and respectfully as she spoke, but he made no particular attempt to disguise the glint of amused skepticism in his eyes. "Do you really mean to tell me you're still afraid of Adrian Gillette?" he asked, when she had finished rehashing the oft-told tale of how Mrs. Gillette had slapped her hand when she had reached for the last cookie on the plate. "That must have been back in, I don't know. But I was still working for Dunninger, so it must have been before 1959, and you're still spooked all these years later. How absolutely Freudian, my dear." "Well, you know, just a little." She widened her eyes, trying to communicate the idea that she was saying a little, but meaning a lot. In truth, she didn't know if she was still scared of old poo-poo breath or not. But she did know she considered Mrs. Gillette a boring old blue-haired booger, and she had no intention of spending the only total eclipse of the sun she'd probably ever see in her company if she could possibly work things around so she could watch it with her daddy, whom she adored beyond the power of words to tell. She evaluated his skepticism and concluded with relief that it was friendly, perhaps even conspiratorial. She smiled and added, "But I also want to stay with you." He raised her hand to his mouth and kissed her fingers like a French masseur. And he hadn't shaved that day. He often didn't when he was at camp, and the rough scrape of his whiskers sent a pleasurable shiver of goosebumps up her arms and back. "Comme tu es douce," he said. "Ma jolie mademoiselle, je t'aime." She giggled, not understanding his clumsy French, but suddenly sure it was all going to work out just the way she had hoped it would. It would be fun, she said happily. "Just the two of us. I could make an early supper and we could eat it right here on the deck." He grinned. "Eclipse burgers adieu." She laughed, nodding and clapping her hands with delight. Then he had said something that struck her as a little odd even at the time, because he was not a man who cared much about clothes and fashions. "You could wear your pretty new sundress." "Sure, if you want," she said, although she had already made a mental note to ask her mother to try and exchange the sundress. It was pretty enough. If you weren't offended by red and yellow stripes, almost bright enough to shout, that was, but it was too small and too tight. Her mother had ordered it from Sears, going mostly by guess and by gosh, but filling in a single size larger than that which had fit Jessie the year before. As it happened, she had grown a little faster than that, in a number of ways. Still, if Daddy liked it, if he would come over to her side of this eclipse business and help her push. He did come over to her side and pushed like Hercules himself. He began that night, suggesting to his wife after dinner and 2 or 3 mellowing glasses of vin rouge that Jessie be excused from tomorrow's eclipse watch outing to the top of Mount Washington. Most of their summer neighbors were going. Just after Memorial Day, they'd begun having informal meetings on the subject of how and where to watch the upcoming solar phenomenon. To Jessie, these meetings had seemed like ordinary run-of-the-mill summer cocktail parties and had even given themselves a name: the Dark Score Sun Worshippers. The Sun Worshippers had rented one of the school district's minibuses for the occasion and were planning to voyage to the top of New Hampshire's tallest mountain equipped with box lunches, Polaroid sunglasses, specially constructed reflector boxes, specially filtered cameras, and champagne, of course, lots and lots of champagne. To Jessie's mother and older sister, all this had seemed to be the very definition of frothy, sophisticated fun. To Jessie, it had seemed the essence of all that was boring, and that was before you added poo-poo breath into the equation. She had gone out on the deck after supper on the evening of the 19th, presumably to read 20 or 30 pages of Mr. C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet before the sun went down. Her actual purpose was a good deal less intellectual. She wanted to listen as her father made their pitch, and to silently root him on. She and Maddie had been aware for years that the combination living room, dining room of the summer house had peculiar acoustical qualities, probably caused by its high, steeply angled ceiling. Jessie had an idea that even Will knew about the way sound carried from in there to out here on the deck. Only their parents seemed unaware that the room might as well have been bugged, and that most of the important decisions they had made in that room, as they sipped after dinner cognac or cups of coffee, were known, to their daughters at least, long before the marching orders were handed down from staff headquarters. Jessie noticed she was holding the Lewis novel upside down and made haste to rectify the situation before Maddie happened by and gave her a big, silent, hoarse laugh. She felt a little guilty about what she was doing. It was a lot closer to eavesdropping than to rooting, when you got right down to it, but not quite guilty enough to stop. And in fact, she considered herself still to be on the right side of a thin moral line. After all, it wasn't as if she were hiding in the closet or anything. She was sitting right here in full view, bathed in the bright light of the westering sun. She was sitting out here with her book and wondering if there were ever eclipses on Mars, and if there were Martians up there to watch them, if there were. If her parents thought no one could hear what they were saying just because they were sitting at the table in there, was that her fault? Was she supposed to go in and tell them? I don't think so, my dear. Jessie whispered in her snottiest Elizabeth Taylor, a cat on the hot tin roof voice, and then cupped her hands over a big, goofy grin, and she guessed she was also safe from her big sister's interference, at least for the time being. She could hear Maddie and Will below her in the rumpus room, squabbling good-naturedly over a game of cootie or parcheesi or something like that. I really don't think it would hurt her to stay here with me tomorrow, do you? Her father was asking in his most winning, good-humored voice. No, of course not, Jessie's mother replied, but it wouldn't exactly kill her to go someplace with the rest of us this summer either. She's turned into a complete daddy's girl. She went down to the puppet show in Bethel with you and Will last week. In fact, didn't you tell me that she stayed with Will, even bought him an ice cream out of her own allowance while you went into that auction barn? That was no sacrifice for our Jessie, Sally replied. She sounded almost grim. What do you mean? I mean, she went to the puppet show because she wanted to, and she took care of Will because she wanted to. Grimness had given way to a more familiar tone. Exasperation. How can you understand what I mean? That tone asked. How can you possibly when you're a man? This was a tone Jessie had heard more and more frequently in her mother's voice these last few years. She knew that was partly because she herself heard more and saw more as she grew up. But she was pretty sure it was also because her mother used that tone more frequently than she once had. Jessie couldn't understand why her father's brand of logic always made her mother so crazy. All of a sudden, the fact that she did something because she wanted to is a cause for concern. Tom was now asking, maybe even a mark against her. What do we do if she develops a social conscience as well as a family one, Sal? Put her in a home for wayward girls? Don't patronize me, Tom. You know perfectly well what I mean. Nope. This time you've lost me in the dust, sweet one. This is supposed to be our summer vacation, remember? And I've always sort of had the idea that when people are on vacation, they're supposed to do what they want to do and be with who they want to be with. In fact, I thought that was the whole idea. Jessie smiled, knowing it was all over, but the shouting. When the eclipse started tomorrow afternoon, she was going to be here with her daddy instead of on top of Mount Washington with poo-poo breath and the rest of the dark score sun worshippers. Her father was like some world-class chess master who had given a talented amateur a run for her money and was now polishing her off. You could come too, Tom. Jessie would come if you did. That was a tricky one. Jessie held her breath. Can't, my love. I'm expecting a call from David Adams on the Brookings Pharmaceuticals portfolio. Very important stuff, also very risky stuff. At this stage, handling Brookings is like handling blasting caps. But let me be honest with you. Even if I could, I'm not really sure I would. I'm not nuts about the Gillette woman, but I can get along with her. That asshole Sleaford, on the other hand. Hush, Tom. Don't worry, Maddie and Will are downstairs and Jessie's way out on the front deck. See her? At that moment, Jessie suddenly became sure that her father knew exactly what the acoustics of the living room, dining room were like. He knew that his daughter was hearing every word of his discussion, wanted her to hear every word. A warm little shiver traced its way up her back and down her legs. I should have known it came down to Dick Sleaford. Her mother sounded angrily amused, a combination that made Jessie's head spin. It seemed to her that only odd adults could combine emotions in so many daffy ways. If feelings were food, adult feelings would be things like chocolate-covered steak, mashed potatoes with pineapple bits, Special K with chili powder sprinkled on it instead of sugar. Jessie thought that being an adult seemed more like a punishment than a reward. This is really exasperating, Tom. The man made a pass at me 6 years ago. He was a drunk. Back in those days, he was always drunk, but he's cleaned up his act. Polly Bergeron told me he goes to AA and bully for him, her father said dryly. Do we send him a get-well card or a merit badge, Sally? Don't be flip. You almost broke the man's nose. Yes, indeed, when a fellow comes into the kitchen to freshen his drink and finds the rum-dum from up the road with one hand on his wife's behind and the other down the front of her. Never mind, she said primly, but Jessie thought that for some reason her mother sounded almost pleased. curiouser and curiouser. The point is, it's time you discovered that Dick Sleaford isn't a demon from the deeps. And it's time just you discovered Adrienne Gillette is just a lonely old woman who once slapped her hand at a lawn party at a little joke. Now, please don't get all crazy on me, Tom. I'm not claiming it was a good joke. It wasn't. Just... Thank you.
You're welcome.